Hey everyone, it's Tornado Tim here. Welcome to my musings on weather. The subject for today is climate change. Yeah, we're not going to talk about the controversial aspect of it. We're just going to look at some climatology events of the past and look and see how the climate had shifted at times, and it will continue to shift. One thing I found interesting when I was studying the climate events of the past was that I lived in the area of the eastern plains of Colorado for a while, and I got to hear a lot of stories of the severe droughts of the past, the things that the farmers and the ranchers went through. And one of it was going back to the 1800s. You know, there was a great movement of people from the east coast to the west, and in the 1800s these farmers were hitting the Great Plains with the idea of using the same farming techniques they used in the wetter eastern regions of the United States. Now, the people living in the west parts of the Great Plains knew what the climatology was like there, and they explained to these new farmers that, well, this land is mostly dry, and there can be times where the rain is really sparse. And we're talking about places like western Kansas, western Nebraska, the western Dakotas, eastern Colorado, even down into Oklahoma Panhandle, the Panhandle of Texas. People who lived there knew these western parts of the states were very dry climates, and rain could be nearly non-existent at times. The problem was eastern farmers, they came with all these great hopes and dreams, and they were eager to plant en masse, and they just started digging up the land like they had been doing in the east, where you just dig up the land and plow it over, and the soil gets exposed up into the sky, and that works when you're in a really wet climate. The land at the time, though, sadly, was filled with this wonderful native grass, and that native grass covered the soil, and it allowed those areas to survive in the harshest drought years that there were, because that native grass, buffalo grass especially, is incredible, can go through long periods of drought, and the roots can go down feet underground. So then when it started raining again, the grass is actually still there, it's just way down deep in the ground. So that land had acclimated to the ebb and flow of the seasonal changes that were sometimes for years drought-ridden, and other times we'd have years of good rains. So now all this native grassland was being taken over with horses and plows and being dug up for planting crops that, well, the climate really, in the long term, was not going to be able to sustain. The thing is these farmers got really excited because they were hearing a lot of things from sources that you would think would be experts. So the eastern farmers, when they came into the west, were incited into digging up the land by, well, the likes of the New York Tribune, for instance, reported in 1866 that cultivating the land could subdue these arid belts and make them more wet. The Republican of Springfield, Massachusetts, penned an article that some theorists contended that with the occupation and use of the country, rains will multiply. So the idea started to be passed along, and was even unfortunately accepted by even some scientists as scientific theory. From 1865 to 1875, there was the term that was going around the country called "the rain follows the plow." Did you hear that? The rain follows the plow. So the idea is wherever you plow up the land, it may have been dry in the past, but now you've turned that soil over and exposed it into the air, and now rain will follow. So sadly, this wasn't just positive thinking journalists and family members who were propagating this theory. There were scientists and government officials who believed that through farming, they were somehow in fact changing the local climates to be wetter and moist instead of parched and drought-ridden. Kind of crazy, isn't it? Well, Ferdinand Hayden, he was the director of the U.S. Geological and Geographical Survey of the Territories from 1868 to 1879. He looked at the whole thing, and he, being somebody who had some science background, he concluded wrongly that the plains had low humidity because the Rocky Mountains had stripped all the moisture from the wind blowing in from the Pacific Ocean. Of course, clearly he hadn't connected the importance of the moisture flow from the Gulf of Mexico in the region. He kind of missed that part. But Hayden had believed that planting of many trees in the eastern plains would even bring rain. Well, then there was Samuel Augie, professor of the University of Nebraska. His expertise was natural sciences, and he argued that the people of Nebraska were in fact squandering their wonderful inheritance of wealth and beauty and power by not fully developing their lands. They need to get out there and dig it up. He concluded, and this is a scientist at a well-known university at the time, he concluded that plowing up the soil would increase the soil's ability to absorb more moisture. He believed that the increase of rain that was happening at the state at the time, and it was a wet years going on there for a while, he believed that that was a direct result of them digging up these native grasses that covered the land, and exposing this virgin soil to the air was actually making it rain more. That was his conclusion. Kind of sometimes when something happens and it seems to be related, it isn't always related. So this idea that the rain follows the plow would of course sooner or later meet up with reality of the real climatology of those regions. If you've lived out here in the West, we're dry. This is not a wet climate like the East. Well, those from this region told me a lot of tales of the past. One I heard of is the drought that hit the plains. It started in the 1885-86 era to 1891. It started in Texas, of course, first, because that's a pretty dry climate, West Texas. They were getting little or no rain, but there had been enough wet years that they just started digging up land everywhere because this is going to help. And there'll be more rain because we're digging up the land. But by 1885, that myth had pretty much fallen apart. And so all these crops that had been planted were failing in large numbers, and farmers were going bankrupt in mass numbers, large numbers. West Texas, if you know, it can be really bone dry. It's a terribly dry climate there. And I wasn't surprised to read that it was one of the first lands to see this drought decimate these new farms. If you've ever been west of Fort Worth, Texas, or Wichita Falls, Texas, just head west from those two spots. It won't take you long to watch that land just get dry, dry, dry. I don't know who in their right mind would have ever thought this is good cropland, because you just drive out there and you go like, why would you try to grow crops here? But there have been just enough myths flowing around, and of course with scientific people backing it up, it kind of messed everybody's minds up, and they were thinking the rain truly follows the plow. But this first in 1885, Texas starts drying out terribly and crops failing, and it started to head north now towards the northern states. You've got the Oklahoma Panhandle just above the Texas Panhandle, and you've got eastern Colorado, western Kansas, and it moved up into western Nebraska, the Dakotas. It just started covering the whole areas as the drought became what typically happens out here, very dry. So that was a disaster time. It was bad. But sadly, human beings, we don't have great memory apparently. We seem to forget history quite rapidly, and today you can see that happening in our world. So even though this myth had pretty much been debunked that the rain follows the plow, because we saw that didn't really work. The early 1900s, we had World War I, and there was a lot of destruction around the world, a lot of death, and there was a need for growing crops. When World War I ended, there was a need for a lot of food, and so plowing began to be reinvigorated at breakneck speeds after World War I. So you get into the early 20s and farming became big business. Of course, they were small farmers, but there was a lot of them. So you have these farmers in large numbers plowing up again back to these western lands that had been starting to get, a little bit more wet again. And the native grasses take over quickly, thank goodness, but then they get dug up again. And so this beautiful native grass that could withstand these droughts and keep the land in place was dug up even further and more land than ever before. And by the 20s, the rush to plant more crops brought us to the inevitable disaster of the 1930s Dust Bowl, as many have heard it. This 1930s drought was even worse than the one that happened in the late 1800s. People who were there, and there's even incredible photographs that you can find online if you just Google it, look for Dust Bowl photos, your eyes will pop out of your head, seriously. This drought was so bad that there was days when the wind would go crazy, when it does here out on the plains of Colorado, Nebraska, Kansas. It gets really windy. Go into the Texas Panhandle, winds start blowing up dust. Well, in the 30s, the dust was blown as high as 2 miles into the sky. That's pretty crazy when you think about it. The dust from the ground is now 10,000 feet in the air. And it got so bad that even during the daytime, it got dark like night, because the clouds of dust were so thick, it just would block out all the sun. And we're not talking about just a 6 or 8 hour high wind event. It would be days on end where you really wouldn't see the sun fully. It would just be clouded over by all this dust. One of the worst days in the 30s from the Dust Bowl was the event known as Black Sunday. Maybe you've heard of that. And it started when the winds went nuts, insane in the Oklahoma Panhandle, and started blowing like crazy. So as that dust went miles into the air, it got caught into a pretty strong jet, and it flew 2,000 miles. 2,000 miles. That Oklahoma dust, Texas dust, Southwest Kansas dust was blown all the way to the East Coast. And on this particular Black Sunday, you would be in New York City and look for the iconic landmarks. Well, guess what? Statue of Liberty was completely cloaked over in this thick, heavy dust. You couldn't see the Statue of Liberty. Even in Washington, you couldn't see the U.S. Capitol because it was so engulfed in all this dust disappearing from view. Everything had been darkened over from these overworked lands that were never meant to be dug up, and this Western Plains clouds of dust ruled the sky all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. It was just a disaster. And when you have climatology events like this, it affects people. And in this case, again, just as it did in the 1800s, it bankrupted a lot of farmers. This one was far worse and just decimated so many farmers that they estimate that some 440,000 people had to migrate from Oklahoma alone. That's a lot of people from the state of Oklahoma, 440,000. And many of these people thought, let's go further west. Maybe it'll be better further west. And they ended up in California. But the people in California were a different type of culture than Oklahoma. And so when these Oklahoma people moved into California, they were given the derogatory term Okies, which would be almost like a cuss word or a swear word or racist word. But anybody that came from Oklahoma into California were Okies. And it was known in California at the time, if you needed really dirt cheap labor, people would do just terribly hard work for next to nothing. Go find some Okies, and they'll do that hard work. And they were somewhat abused when they came into California at first, and utilized very sadly as very poor cheap labor. Then they didn't care about the people. So you see, climatology, these major climatology events that do take place have a terrible impact on humanity. So I understand why people are worried about climate change. The thing is climate change is real. I mean, we read of just 2 stories here. 1800s, the 1930s. You'll see climate change happens. It can change radically from decade to decade. And these aren't minor disasters. These were extreme disasters that took place. If you look at the 1930s photos, you kind of wonder what the heck. How come people aren't talking about the huge disastrous climatology events from the past, because those were major. So extreme weather has been around since the beginning of time. And so, I don't just like to study extreme weather, I like to look at the history of the past. I mean, you'll find me out on the eastern plains of Colorado and western Kansas, western Nebraska, even in the Dakotas every spring. I love chasing down severe weather and these major weather events that we have here out on the plains of Colorado. Tornado Alley has had a lot of disasters. Looking at these terrible dust bowls and droughts of the past, we're in terrible droughts again right now, and we still have these monster tornadoes out on the eastern plains. You begin to wonder why anybody would have ever wanted to live out here on the plains. We get some extreme weather here, but just remember that climate change does happen. It can be for a few years, it can be decade, it can cover large spans, and the events when the climatology changes can be extreme. We can see extreme weather. It's just part of the way our weather systems work. So maybe this summer or this spring, you're out chasing, you may run into me, because I like to cover as many states as I can. Of course, I like the ones closest to home, but I hope to be out and see some of you this year, and you want to just sit down and talk about some weather events of the past. I'd sure love to hear your stories, and maybe we can cover some of them in this podcast. Well, until next time, everyone, this is Tornado Tim. Have a good day.